Imagine building a life with someone you love, years of trust, shared dreams, and a future carefully planned. Imagine waking up each morning beside them, believing they are your partner, your confidant, the one person who would stand by you through anything. Now, imagine that person carrying a secret so deep, so carefully hidden, that it would shatter everything you thought you knew. A secret that would turn love into betrayal, safety into danger, and life into death. In a quiet home, in a quiet town, a man is going about his day, unaware that every moment is bringing him closer to the end. A man who trusted too much, loved too deeply, and saw no reason to question the people closest to him. A man whose kindness, whose faith in family, would be repaid in the worst way imaginable. Everything seemed normal. A thriving career. A devoted spouse. A life that, from the outside, looked secure, stable, ordinary. But what looks ordinary is not always safe. What looks like love is not always real. And what seems like loyalty can, in the blink of an eye, turn into something else entirely. The walls of his home held conversations he never heard, whispers he never suspected, plans he never imagined. His world was peaceful. His routine, familiar. He had no idea that decisions had already been made. That phone calls had already been placed. That promises had been exchanged, not of love, not of commitment, but of something else. And when the moment came, when the final piece fell into place, there would be no second chances. No warning. No escape. This is the story of Marc Despain. A husband. A businessman. A man who had everything to live for, until the one thing he never saw coming took it all away. Stay with us as we uncover a case of deception, betrayal, and a killer who hid in plain sight. If you love true crime stories that expose the darkest corners of the human heart, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning. Marc Despain was a man who worked hard for everything he had. At 34 years old, he had built a successful career as a real estate appraiser and property investor in Jonesboro, Arkansas. He wasn't just another businessman, he had a sharp eye for opportunity, a talent for turning a profit, and the drive to keep pushing forward. People who knew him described him as determined, confident, and always focused on his next move. He had worked alongside his father for years, learning the ins and outs of the industry, and when the time came, he carved out his own path, building a name for himself. He had a nice home, a family, and a future that seemed secure. But success doesn't always bring happiness. And trust doesn't always mean safety. Behind closed doors, there were problems. Strains in his relationships that most people didn't see. Tensions that simmered just beneath the surface. In business, Marc was careful, he made smart decisions, he protected his interests. But in his personal life, his guard was down. He trusted the people around him, the ones closest to him. And that trust would cost him everything. Betrayal doesn't always come from a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it comes from the people we share our lives with. The ones who smile at us across the dinner table. The ones who know our weaknesses, our fears, our blind spots. The ones we never think to question. And when betrayal comes from within, it isn't sudden. It doesn't happen in an instant. It builds over time, one choice at a time, one lie at a time, until the moment comes when there's no turning back. Marc Despain's murder wasn't random. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't the work of some unknown intruder slipping into the night. This was something else. Something planned. Something personal. And as the investigation would later reveal, the truth behind his death was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. A crime born from greed, resentment, and the cold calculation of those he trusted the most. The walls of his home held secrets he never saw coming. Conversations he never overheard. Promises that had nothing to do with love, or loyalty, or family. A decision had been made long before the moment the trigger was pulled. And by the time Marc realized the danger, it was already too late. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and a murder that was never meant to look like one. A story of deception woven so tightly that, for a while, it almost worked. But secrets have a way of coming out. And the truth, no matter how well hidden, always leaves a trace. Marc Despain was the kind of man who believed in hard work. He built a successful career in real estate, not because it was handed to him, but because he earned it. He had spent years working alongside his father, learning the business inside and out. By the time he struck out on his own, he had already made a name for himself, someone who knew the value of a good investment, someone who could turn struggling properties into something profitable. He was respected in the industry, known for being sharp, determined, and always one step ahead in business. But no amount of success could have prepared him for what was coming. At home, Marc was a family man. He had built a life with Michelle, his wife, a woman who had been by his side for years. To the outside world, they were a team, partners in business, partners in life. But inside their marriage, cracks were forming. Michelle enjoyed the finer things, and Marc worked hard to provide them. He made sure their lifestyle matched the image they projected, a house filled with everything they wanted, the security of a steady income, the promise of more. But for Michelle, it was never quite enough. Money wasn't just a necessity, it was a source of control, of comfort, of status. And when tension began to build in their marriage, it wasn't over love or commitment, it was over power. Behind the perfect image of their marriage, something was shifting. Michelle wasn't just a wife standing by her husband's side. She was someone with her own agenda, her own desires, and when things didn't go her way, she didn't accept it quietly. She wasn't content to let Marc make all the decisions, to be the one in charge. And when she realized that staying married to him no longer benefited her the way it once had, she started looking for a way out, one that would leave her in control. That's where Carl Kelly came in. Michelle's father. A man who should have been a protector, a guiding force in his daughter's life. Instead, he became something else entirely. A man willing to cross lines most people wouldn't dare. He wasn't just an outsider to the crime, he was part of it. A man willing to make things happen, to take steps that most wouldn't even consider. He wasn't afraid of what it would take, because for him, this was about something more. But a murder like this doesn't happen without planning. It doesn't happen without the right people. That's where Terence Barker came in. A hitman. Someone who knew how to get a job done. Someone who didn't ask too many questions. He was brought into the plan, handed the details, and given the task. And when the time came, he did exactly what he was paid to do. He walked into Marc Despain's home, into the place where Marc should have been safest, and pulled the trigger. But there was one more piece to the puzzle. Johnny Hubbard. An associate. A man who wasn't just watching from the sidelines but had his own role to play. Someone who helped make sure everything fell into place. A man who, whether out of loyalty, desperation, or greed, found himself tangled in something that couldn't be undone. And then there were the investigators. The ones who would put the pieces together. The ones who would look past the carefully crafted alibi, past the version of events that had been put forward, and see the truth. Because a murder like this leaves traces, no matter how well it's planned. And once those traces started to appear, the whole story began to unravel. August 24, 2011, was supposed to be just another day. Marc Despain had no reason to believe that anything was out of the ordinary. He went about his business, dealing with real estate, managing properties, making sure everything in his world kept moving forward. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his fate had already been decided. That the people closest to him had already set the wheels in motion. That before the day was over, everything he had built, everything he had worked for, would come to an abrupt and violent end. The call came in the afternoon. A frantic voice on the other end of the line. Michelle Despain. Hysterical, desperate, gasping between sobs as she told the 911 operator that she had just found her husband. That he was down. That he wasn't breathing. That someone had been in their home. The dispatcher tried to calm her, tried to get details. But Michelle kept crying, kept repeating the same thing: he was gone, he was shot, someone had broken in. When police arrived, the scene was chaos. Marc was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, the life drained from his body. He had been shot multiple times, and there was no sign of struggle. No defensive wounds, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a fight had taken place. It looked clean. Too clean. A few things had been taken, small valuables, items that could be carried out quickly, but nothing that made sense for a real burglary. The home itself wasn't ransacked. The signs of forced entry were there, but they didn't quite add up. Michelle was outside, shaking, crying, barely able to speak. She told officers she had been out running errands. That she had walked into the house and found him like that. That she didn't know who could have done this. She was devastated, inconsolable, a wife who had just lost her husband in the most brutal way imaginable. But for the officers on the scene, something didn't sit right. Burglaries don't usually end in execution-style murders. If someone breaks in and gets caught, they run. They don't take the time to shoot the homeowner multiple times. And even if they do, they don't leave the place looking staged, like a crime scene that had been put together just for show. As investigators worked through the details, the story started to shift. Michelle's grief seemed real, but something about it felt practiced. Too much, too fast, too dramatic. And then there was Carl Kelly, her father. He showed up quickly, comforting his daughter, supporting her, standing beside her through the initial chaos. But his presence raised its own questions. His behavior was protective, but in a way that felt more controlling than concerned. He wasn't just a grieving father-in-law. He was something else. As detectives started digging, the pieces didn't fit the way they should have. The burglary theory started falling apart. The people closest to Marc, the ones who should have been the most heartbroken, were the same ones who seemed to have the most to gain. And slowly, suspicion started to form. Because sometimes, the real threat doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. The first cracks in the story appeared almost immediately. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic home invasion gone wrong, but when detectives started questioning Michelle, the details didn't line up. Her timeline was inconsistent. She said she had been out running errands for hours, but there were gaps in her movements that couldn't be accounted for. She claimed she had no idea who could have done this, yet she never asked the most obvious question, the one that any grieving wife would ask first. Who killed my husband? Instead, Michelle focused on the burglary angle, almost as if she wanted the police to believe it without question. But seasoned investigators knew better. They had seen real burglaries before, real home invasions, real panic. And something about Michelle's reaction didn't feel right. It was too rehearsed, too structured. It was grief, but grief with a script. Then came the financials. Marc had been successful, very successful. His real estate business had flourished, and with it, so had his lifestyle. A beautiful home, luxury vacations, expensive cars. But that money hadn't come without tension. Marc had been careful with his finances, meticulous about his investments. Michelle, on the other hand, had a taste for something more. She loved the finer things, and she had grown used to having them. But Marc had been pulling back, tightening expenses, making decisions that Michelle didn't agree with. And when investigators started digging deeper, they uncovered something chilling. Marc had recently taken out a large life insurance policy. A policy that Michelle stood to benefit from. The questions started coming harder, and Michelle's story started shifting. First, she was adamant that Marc had no enemies. Then, when pressed, she mentioned that he had been under stress, that maybe someone from work had a problem with him. But no one in Marc's business circle had any real issues with him. He wasn't reckless with his deals, he wasn't involved in anything illegal, and he had no major disputes. The real problems weren't with Marc's business. They were in his home. Investigators got a break when they pulled phone records. At first, nothing stood out. But then, a closer look revealed something strange. A series of messages between Michelle and her father, Carl, had been deleted. Not just casual messages, specific ones, right before Marc's murder. They were able to recover some of them, and what they found changed everything. Michelle and Carl had been discussing something in coded language. It wasn't overt, but it was clear enough. Talk of making things easier, of taking care of things once and for all. And then, most damning of all, a message from Michelle just days before Marc was killed, instructing Carl to make sure it was done right. With this discovery, the investigation took a sharp turn. Carl Kelly, the devoted father, the grieving father-in-law, was now a prime suspect. But he hadn't acted alone. Enter Terence Barker and Johnny Hubbard. Barker was the hired gun, the man who had pulled the trigger. He was a low-level criminal, someone who had spent years in and out of trouble, always looking for a quick payday. And then there was Hubbard, the middleman. The one who had set everything up, making sure the plan ran smoothly. It didn't take long before the pressure got to them. Barker cracked first. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he confessed, yes, he had killed Marc Despain, but he hadn't done it alone. He had been hired. Paid. Told exactly what to do, where to be, and when. And the orders had come from Carl. With Barker's confession, the entire plot unraveled. Carl had orchestrated the murder, but he hadn't done it for himself. He had done it for his daughter. For Michelle. She wanted out of her marriage, but she didn't want a divorce. She wanted the money. She wanted the lifestyle. And in her mind, there was only one way to get it. As the details came out, the media exploded with the story. A family torn apart by greed. A father willing to have his own son-in-law killed. A wife who stood by and let it happen. In Jonesboro, a town where people believed in family, in loyalty, in doing what was right, the betrayal hit hard. The community was shocked, disgusted. They had seen crimes before, but nothing like this. Nothing this cold. Nothing this personal. The walls were closing in. The truth was out. And now, it was only a matter of time before justice would be served. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, the weight of what had happened heavy in the air. The case had gripped the town of Jonesboro, sending shockwaves through the community. A man had been murdered, not by some stranger in a random act of violence, but by those closest to him, his own wife, his father-in-law, and the men they had brought into the plan. The trial wasn't just about justice. It was about betrayal, about greed, about the terrifying reality that sometimes the ones we trust the most are the ones capable of the unthinkable. Carl Kelly, the mastermind, sat stone-faced as the charges were read. First-degree murder. He knew what was coming. There would be no trial, no attempt to fight the charges. The evidence was too strong, the confessions too damning. His voice barely wavered as he pleaded guilty. There was no apology, no show of remorse, just a flat acceptance of his fate. The judge didn't hesitate. 35 years in prison. For a man in his 60s, it was as good as a life sentence. He would never walk free again. Terence Barker, the hitman, followed. He had been the one to pull the trigger, the one who had ended Marc Despain's life in cold blood. But in the eyes of the law, he was no different than the man who had hired him. He, too, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. 35 years. Another man condemned to spend the rest of his days behind bars for a crime that had never needed to happen. Then there was Johnny Hubbard. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had played his part. He had helped plan it, helped arrange it, made sure everything was set in motion. His charge was different, hindering apprehension. A lesser charge, but still a serious one. He pleaded guilty and received 18 years. Not as long as the others, but long enough to ensure he wouldn't be walking free anytime soon. And then, there was Michelle. The woman at the center of it all. The grieving widow who had stood on the front porch, crying for the cameras, insisting she had no idea who could have done this. The woman who had sat across from detectives, spinning lies, knowing full well what she had set into motion. She wasn't charged with murder. There wasn't enough to prove she had directly ordered the killing, that she had explicitly told Carl and Barker to do it. But she had known. She had encouraged it. She had played her role in covering it up, in hiding the truth. Hindering apprehension. She took a plea deal. 30 years. Not as long as the others, but long enough to make sure she wouldn't be walking away anytime soon. The moment the sentence was handed down, she showed no reaction. No tears, no pleas for mercy. Just silence. As if she had finally accepted what she had done, what it had cost. But outside the courtroom, there were questions. There always are in cases like this. Some people believed Michelle had gotten off too easy, that she had been just as responsible as Carl, as Barker, as Hubbard. Others questioned why she had been offered a plea deal at all. Had she cooperated more than the public knew? Had she given investigators more information behind the scenes? The truth was something only the prosecution and law enforcement fully understood, but the outcome was clear: she would spend decades in prison. For Mark's family, there was no relief, no real victory. There was justice, but justice doesn't bring back the dead. A son was gone, a friend was lost. The community would never forget the crime that had shattered their trust, that had revealed a darkness lurking behind the perfect image of a happy marriage. The trial was over. The sentences were final. But the scars of what had happened would remain forever. Betrayal is one of the hardest things for the human mind to process. We expect deception from outsiders, from enemies, from those who mean us harm. But from the people we share our lives with? The ones who sit across from us at the dinner table, who share our home, who promise to love and protect us. That kind of betrayal cuts deeper than any knife, shatters trust in ways that can never be repaired. Marc Despain never saw it coming. He built his life around people he believed cared about him. A wife he provided for, a father-in-law he trusted, a business he had worked hard to grow. He had no idea that, behind the surface, there was a plan being made, decisions happening in whispered conversations, texts exchanged in secret. He was walking toward his fate without a clue, without a warning, until the moment he fell to the floor, his own life slipping away at the hands of men he had never wronged. The impact of his murder didn't end with the sentencing. There were the aftershocks, the pain left behind in the people who truly loved him. His mother, who had to sit in that courtroom and hear how the woman her son married had been part of his death. Friends, colleagues, those who had known him as a good man, an honest businessman, someone who had worked hard for everything he had. They were the ones left asking the same question over and over: why? Why did it come to this? Why was money more important than a human life? Why was greed allowed to fester into something so violent, so irreversible? And it raises an even darker question: how well do we really know the people closest to us? The ones we trust the most? Would we recognize the signs if they were plotting against us? Would we see it coming? Or would we, like Mark, only realize the truth in our final moments, when it's far too late? What would you do if you uncovered a horrifying truth about your own family? If you found out the person you lay next to at night, the person who smiled at you every morning, had been planning something unthinkable? Would you recognize the deception? Or would you, like so many others before, believe that love and trust were enough to keep the darkness at bay? Justice was served in a courtroom, but justice doesn't undo the crime. It doesn't bring Mark back. It doesn't erase the pain or make sense of the senseless. The story of Marc Despain is more than just a crime, it's a lesson, a warning. A reminder that the greatest threats don't always come from the outside. Sometimes, they come from right beside us. If this story has left you with questions, you're not alone. The twists, the betrayals, the decisions that led to Marc Despain's final moments, these are the kinds of stories that make us stop and think. They remind us that the most dangerous threats aren't always lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, they sit across from us at the dinner table. If you found this case as unsettling as we did, make sure to hit that like button. It helps bring these stories to more people who, just like you, are drawn to the complex, often disturbing realities of true crime. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover real cases, real lives, and real tragedies, stories that deserve to be remembered, stories that deserve to be told. Next time, we're covering another shocking case, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty, deception, and the secrets people will do anything to keep buried. You won't want to miss it. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you make of this case? Could anything have stopped what happened? And how do you think justice should be served in cases like this? Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next one.